Welcome back to Gold Derby. I'm Christopher Rosen. I'm so pleased to be joined by David Scarpa, the acclaimed screenwriter behind All the Money in the World and Napoleon, whose new film is Ridley Scott's long-awaited sequel to Gladiator, Gladiator II. David, I just want to start there. Obviously, it's your third film with Ridley after those two projects. I think there's been discussions about Gladiator 2 maybe going back more than 20 years. I was like thinking like about this. And I was reading another interview with Ridley where he was like, a lot of writers were afraid maybe to even take on this project. So I guess when you first were approached to, write this, what would become Gladiator 2, I guess like, yeah, what was your thoughts and how'd you kind of want to approach the material?
I wasn't aware that the other writers were afraid. Maybe if I had known, I would have been afraid too. But I just sort of said yes, and then figured we'd figure it out as we go. But yeah, I mean, it's obvious. Like it took quite a long time. Obviously, like 25 years. And normally, a movie as successful as the first one was would have a sequel almost immediately. But they had sort of walled themselves off from it by having both Maximus and Commodus die at the end of the movie, which created, meant that the traditional paths were kind of, as I say, they weren't available. And in a weird way, I think that arguably sort of served us creatively in that you were sort of forced to make more interesting choices and come in a different place and approach a sequel in a different way than you normally would. And so in the end, it kind of meant that we did something different.
You've obviously, like I said, you worked with Ridley twice before. My sense from him, and I've never met him, but he seems like he doesn't suffer fools, and he is very decisive as a filmmaker based on his films. So I guess as a writer, and especially with this kind of project, like how does that help you, and how does your collaboration, like kind of create this product that is so successful? I guess.
Um, I think, yeah, as you say, he definitely knows what he likes, right? He has strong opinions one way or the other. He's very decisive. As you say, he doesn't suffer fools. He's very, I mean, he knows what he likes almost immediately, and you'll know if he responds to it just because like you send him pages or whatever it is, and he sends you back story, the next day it'll be storyboarded where he sketched it all out or whatever. So it's very clear what he likes and what resonates with him. And so as a result, it's always been, you can go in and tell him an idea, and he's going to respond to it immediately, and you can kind of go from there. And that's always been sort of the nature of the relationship.
So you mentioned like taking like you know being served by the corner you're left in at the end of the first Gladiator with this, and like kind of coming into the sequel with some like new ideas. Obviously, like the big one is I guess Lucius being Maximus's son, which obviously is
Right.
like a key thing. And I guess like that's lightly alluded to. I think if you watch the original, you could walk away with that, but it's not implicitly or explicitly said. I guess why did you decide that was such a great way to go about this and to use that character to like call back to Maximus in that fashion, I guess.
Well, in a sense, I mean, as I say, because Maximus is dead, and because Commodus is dead, but mostly Maximus. And also, obviously, you can't do a gladiator prequel because he wasn't a gladiator before the first, so it wouldn't be really a gladiator movie. And that sort of closed off the path to having a Maximus centric sequel. But the I think unconsciously they sort of they created Lucius, as Maximus's son, and left a tiny little bit in there that suggested that this was Maximus and Lucilla's son right up front. And so that with the passage of 20 years meant that you could bring Lucius back. You couldn't do it for 20 years, right? But it meant that 20 years later you could do a Lucius centric story. And what that meant is that for me at least, my attitude was, instead of thinking of this the way conventional sequels are done, which is Die Hard and the same guy comes along and now he's in an airport or whatever it is, I went back to things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is in a sense sequels, right? The Odyssey is effectively a sequel to the Iliad, but it's a completely different thing, and it's taking place after a long span of time. And in a way, part of the idea of the story is to use that duration of time, which is what has happened over this large span of, it's not something that's happening a year later or 2 years later. It's happening 20 years later. And what are sort of the generational of the choices that Maximus has made. And in a weird way, that Iliad Odyssey kind of dynamic serves a story like that's set in Rome, or this sort of classical story, very well. And it gives it sort of this, or The Godfather, this big sort of multi-generational family story, as opposed to simply we're just going to have the same guy come back and do all the same stuff,
Right.
later.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean, I think that comes through in the movie really well, and I love how it feels, like you said, like of a piece of Gladiator, but obviously like its own thing. I guess the other thing I was thinking of, and you're as a writer here, like Gladiator, obviously great film, remains I think a classic in a lot of people's minds. Won the Oscar. There's so many quotable lines from it, right? Like, "Are you not entertained?" All these things that I
Yeah.
still hear. So I guess as a writer, and I was like, again, like you're saying, like in Die Hard a lot, it's like, oh, they're repeating like a lot of sequels are repeating like the
Yeah.
catchphrases as it were. This film doesn't do that. I find that really fascinating. I was like, oh, it's like,
Yeah.
so I guess like, did you think like before you sat down to do this, did you go back and like watch the or think about the original and then like take away all the stuff that maybe would be easy to reference or call back to and like kind of make it feel like more original than as its own story, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always the temptation. Luckily, Ridley doesn't like doing that. Like, he doesn't really like taking the easy road and doing the greatest hits album. And so he doesn't, and that's fortunate, because I think if you were to simply go back and sort of do a catchphrase kind of thing where you're just doing it for the fans and playing the hits, as it were, it really, I mean, it's easy, but it's just not earned. I think we were very focused just on telling the best possible story, and making it work on its own terms, and letting everything come organically. I mean, it's important to know, like, that first movie, they didn't think they were manufacturing catchphrases, right?
Right.
They didn't know how the movie was going to do. They simply were trying to tell the best story and bring the character to life. And so that's really what you want to do the second time around, which is simply tell the best story you can, and not. I think audiences know when you're pandering to them in a lot of ways, and in a way they respect you a little bit more if you don't do that.
Yeah, definitely. I 100% agree with that. The
Yeah.
other thing I think you do in this is create, like you're saying, like a lot of new characters, all of whom I was like super engaged by, especially Macron, as played by Denzel Washington. I have to be honest, when I saw that he was in it and cast, I was like, oh, he'll probably be like Oliver Reed type, like kind of come
Yeah.
in, knock out a few scenes and like leave. He's in it
Yeah.
so much. He is so awesome in this movie. And I
Yeah.
guess like it's such a great character too. Was that when you were talking initial stages about this, like how like or I guess like did the character grow once you knew Denzel was playing it, or was that always like such a huge character in the script? Because it's hard to kind of imagine the movie without him. But like, yeah, I guess like how did that all kind of come together? Because he's such a great
Well,
character.
in a weird way, I mean, it's like, you knew what the first movie did. And in essence, a lot of it was, how do we not do what the first movie did? Meaning, I mean, the first movie was very much a father-son triangle, right? Meaning a father and two sons, Richard Harris and Marcus Aurelius and Maximus and this other. So they were two brothers. They weren't really brothers, but in essence they were, and it was brother against brother. The Cain and Abel effectively was that first movie. And so the question, but we obviously didn't want to go in that route, but we also wanted to sort of tease that a little. We wanted to play with the audience's expectations of what they were going to see, because people are conditioned to think that they're going to see the same movie the second time around. So they inevitably go that direction. So we still had the emperors as a figure in it, as one pole of the movie. But ultimately, the primal relationships are more about mother and son here, about their relationship, and also about, I mean, it's still kind of oddly about family relationships, but it's just slightly different, in that it's her and him as opposed to Marcus Aurelius and Maximus. But also, what we found ourselves asking is, what is a relationship that is as primal as the relationship between brother and brother, right? And without going to that place, and effectively it was master and slave, right? I mean, it's Lucius is tied to this guy who seems to be promising him you see what I mean? And it's like, and there's a sort of a real primal desire to be free, and that was very interesting, and it led to interesting, without giving me spoilers away, it led to interesting directions for Macrinus himself in terms of making him a much more moral, very, very Shakespearean kind of Iago, Richard III kind of character, but at the same time giving him some moral ambiguity.
And so you mentioned like the Shakespearean actors. I mean, like obviously Denzel Washington, one of the greatest Shakespeare actors probably ever who's ever lived. It
Yeah,
does feel very Shakespearean in this role, and he is like he is just dining out on your dialogue that you've written, right?
yeah,
Like he's like having such a
yeah.
great time. I guess like yeah, like does it? How great is it to know like when you're writing this stuff, like oh well, Denzel's gonna crush this because you could, or does it let you be more even go further with the character because you know an actor like Denzel is gonna be able to just nail it.
Well, in the first draft, it wasn't like Denzel. We there was typically when you write these things, you really don't know who's
Hmm.
going to be. Like we didn't know Paul was going to be in it. We didn't know. I mean, the most we knew was Connie. So it wasn't necessarily a matter of. I mean, because among other things, you don't know if he. I mean, it was obviously the first choice for the role, but it was. Is he going to be available? Does he want to do it? Whatever it is, like you just don't know. So you never really write to a specific person. But obviously, and this is what one of the things that Ridley's so brilliant at is casting, which is the idea of sort of once you plug him in to that role, it changes
Hmm.
it character in a completely different direction in its own way. I mean, makes everything his own. So that was part of it, and I think, but it was clear that you could definitely see what he was going to do with a lot of that material.
Yeah, like we were saying, like I think it's a great, like a classic character that like is just gonna be like you said, like the original is like there's so many classic characters. This is another, I think, classic
Yeah,
character. But I also, I mean, like a lot of the, I love the emperors, like you said, Keith and Caracalla, obviously based on real life emperors, are great too. You have down the line, I think this is like just a really fun movie with like a lot of good
yeah.
performances and characters. I want to ask you, like you mentioned, like bringing back like Lucilla obviously and like Lucius in older, but I guess were there thoughts about other characters from the original that you would maybe fold in or not? And how did you kind of decide how far you wanted to go back into the original of characters who were still living after, like that kind of thing?
There was definitely lots of talk of it. I mean, and yet at the same time, I mean, we sort of wound up in the process of making the movie with the people we wound up with, if that makes any sense. I mean, I think clearly we knew that the relationship between Lucius and Lucilla was going to be really important because it's sort of the emotional heart of it. And it is, as I say, it's an odyssey, right? He's gone away for however many years and now he's back, and it's not his wife, but it's his mother, but it's the relationships he left behind and his own identity and things like that. I think that's really sort of what we built the whole thing around.
Right. And I mentioned last you obviously, like I said, you also wrote Napoleon with Ridley. I know last year I remember he's like I said, Ridley does not suffer fools. I remember one interview he was like people were complaining about some historical accuracy and Ridley was like, get a
Yeah,
life, I think was what
yeah,
he said. And I guess
yeah.
like for you, and I love that because I think that's true. And I guess for you, I guess I was like, obviously there's so much historical detail and research that you're doing in this. And I guess how for you as the writer, how much are you like is it how much you need to stay historically accurate versus like just writing the best story and keeping the vibe and the theme of the history, right? Whereas like, versus like being to the letter accurate.
I definitely do a lot of research, and part of that is what I present to him, which is, for instance, like the baths of Caracalla. Do we want to use the baths of, he's famous for building these Roman baths or whatever. Like we had a lot of historical detail that ultimately doesn't necessarily get used because I think, for Ridley, there's some directors who might be really nailed down to tell. I mean, I think what's crucial is we're definitely, and the first movie didn't do this either, by the way. Like Marcus Aurelius was not strangled by Commodus, right? Like Commodus didn't die the way. Like these are characters that are based on real people, but none of the stuff that happened in that first movie actually happened the way it's depicted. You
Mhm.
know, and I think that's fine, by the way. Like if that encourages people to go out and read Marcus Aurelius, to learn the history, to read, Mary Beard or any of these great scholars of ancient Rome, I think that's fantastic. But it was definitely clear also from the template that first movie set that we were not treating this as like a history lesson.
Mhm.
We were not, that was definitely not the focus. And so it ultimately came down to largely what felt right dramatically for everybody, and especially for Ridley, as opposed to delivering strictly biographical details.
Yeah, I think that makes sense too. I mean,
Yeah,
it's historical fiction, right? It's not like he said, it's
yeah.
not like a
And I
documentary.
mean, it's very far. I mean, it is true. Well, there is a lot of stuff in the movie that is historical,
Hmm.
when it comes to Caracalla and Gaeta and things like that and their relationship and all of that. I mean, it's based on that. And, even Macronus was later after, like all that stuff is there. But as I said, with the first movie, they didn't bother to, they weren't following that template,
No.
historical template at all. And we aren't either. So,
You mentioned at the top here, I think you mentioned like also like The Godfather, right? Godfather Part Two and
yeah,
Part Three. So obviously, I mean, no spoilers and stuff, but there is definitely room for a. I watched this movie. It's like, man, let's do Part Three. Got there, like could
yeah,
easily you could easily imagine this going further. I guess if you already started thinking about that or talked. I mean, Ridley seemingly is never stops working. I just got a Deadline news alert that he's doing something else with Paul. Like he just
yeah.
truly never stops. So I guess what have you thought about Gladiator Three, or would that even be something that
I
you just
have not really thought about it much at all. I'm sure Ridley is way ahead on this. Like I'm sure he's already sort of mapped it out in his own head. I mean, luckily I don't work as hard as him, so I don't have to sweat it quite as much. But I can assure you, it's I'm sure that's going to happen at some point. So
right? And I guess was that did you guys ever? I mean, when you were talking, like, did you think that like it's not a surprise, I guess, right? That you would think like the way it kind of sets up three, I guess.
um I mean, again, no spoilers,
Right.
but I mean, it's also all right. Just in terms of one of the things that the first movie kind of walled off for us is the idea of ending exactly the same way as the first movie does. So, in a strange way, and also in a young man's story, it's inevitably just like The Godfather does set up. All right, where is this guy going?
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
question of where is this guy going to go over the course of the rest of his life.
Right.
He's only just beginning, so it's inevitable that it's going to set up those questions.
Yeah, it's a great. I really like I said at the top, like 25 years or whatever to make this movie and to have it be such a success. I think is like really really cool. David Scarpa, obviously,
That's great.
writer of Gladiator II, coming soon to theaters. David, thank you for doing this. It was really great chatting with you.
Thank you very much, Christopher.